Today's show is sponsored by Datadog, a cloud-scale monitoring platform that unifies metrics, logs, and traces from technologies like Istio, AppMesh, and Envoy. Plus, Datadog's Service Map automatically plots out the dependencies in your microservices architectures for seamless, context-rich troubleshooting. With rich visualizations, algorithmic alerting, and more than 250 vendor-supported integrations, Datadog allows you to monitor your distributed applications in real time. Start a free 14-day trial today by visiting datadog.com/cloudcast. And Datadog will send you a great free t-shirt. That's datadog.com/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. August continues to roll along. We are here into the second week of August. And, you know, if you ask me, other than it just being incredibly hot and humid and muggy, feels a lot like March and April, May, June, July. Yeah, basically every month feels exactly the same these days. So if you're out there and you're living in a place that's just dealing with the COVID well, congratulations. Glad that you are healthy and safe. If you're living here in the States and every day feels like Groundhog's Day, well, maybe someday we'll get that right. But right now it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. But we plow along. Let's dive into the cloud news of the week because we need a little bit of happiness and joy in terms of things being invented and new ideas coming out. First thing in cloud news of the week is that Microsoft launched the Open Service Mesh. For those of you that were following the service mesh space, you know that there was a little bit of a hullabaloo, a little bit of a kerfuffle that went on with how Google handled Istio. Was not donated to the CNCF as many expected long ago. It was kind of created their own new foundation for Istio, which is, kind of ruffled a few feathers in the service mesh space. So Microsoft came along. They had done some work around something called SMI, Service Mesh Interface, a while ago, kind of looking ahead to say, hey, there may be more than one mesh out in the world. And obviously we see things like Linkerd and, stuff from Kong, and we see things like Istio and others. So Open Service Mesh is sort of a lighter weight service mesh. It's built around the Envoy proxy. And Microsoft has stated that they will be donating it to the CNCF so that there shouldn't be any confusion around conformance and compliance and governance and so forth. So interesting to see that sort of happen. It happened sort of right on the heels of the Istio announcement. And we'll see how that all sort of shakes out in terms of, what companies decide in terms of what sort of meshes they want, how important governance is, open governance versus open source, and how the community as a whole reacts in terms of vendors maybe making shifts in their product roadmaps based on this decision, versus the Istio decision. So will be an interesting thing to watch as we move into later part of 2020 and into 2021. And in follow-on service mesh news, Kong announced Kong Mesh 1.0. So big week for service meshes. Kong had been kind of in the service mesh space, mostly in the API gateway space previously, but had been kind of dabbling in service meshes. They had come out with something called the Kuma Mesh. And so the Kong Mesh is really kind of service mesh built on the Kuma Mesh, which Kong had been donating to the CNCF, as well as Envoy as the proxy. So seeing a lot of service mesh built on top of Envoy. There was some fun little spats going on Twitter between the folks from Linkerd and Kelsey Hightower about how everybody needs to learn Envoy as a core thing. It's sort of become the new, hard way to learn something. So kind of interesting to watch that if you're into Twitter spats. But yeah, the service mesh space is heating up. There is a lot going on in the space. Congratulations to Kong on getting that out there. It's a hot company to watch, somebody we really probably should have on the podcast at some point in time. And then finally, McKinsey had an interesting paper that came out. They called it the 10 anti-patterns that are derailing technology transformations. And, if you dive through it, you're probably going to feel pretty comfortable seeing a lot of them in there. It's everything from, we built the technology without a business problem. We built the technology because it was hot. It didn't necessarily apply to what we were, the space we were trying to work in, sort of resume-driven development. There's some talk about, having fragmented groups within an organization all building their own approach to cloud and everybody building their own, infrastructure, their own cloud, their own platform. So it's an interesting read. If nothing else, it should be, kind of a good checklist for you to go through and be like, is my company doing that? Are the companies I work with doing that? We probably should stop doing that. So anyways, good read. Nice write-up by the folks at McKinsey. And it's always good to sort of have stuff brought up to a little bit higher business level. So we're going to wrap that up for Cloud News of the Week. And we have a really interesting sort of new topic we're going to dig into. We're going to dig a little bit into GraphQL, which is gaining a lot of traction in the API space. Have a fun sort of new startup that's going to help talk to us about GraphQL. And up front, I need to apologize. One of the things that I am absolutely horrible with on this show is names. I let the guests always know up front, I'm probably going to butcher your name, and boy, did I get this one butchered. So up front, I apologize to both Tanmai as well as Yoshi from Hasura, a new startup out in the Bay Area that is doing some very cool with GraphQL, and there I go butchering names and words again. But I apologize to them up front because, boy, in the introduction to this one, did I butcher their names. And the rest of the interview is awesome. Please ignore the first 30 seconds or so when I get that wrong. But excited to jump into that right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by DivvyCloud. DivvyCloud protects cloud and container environments from policy violations, threats, IAM challenges, and misconfigurations. Types of misconfigurations that have cost enterprises a jaw-dropping $5 trillion over the last 2 years. DivvyCloud provides continuous security and compliance across all cloud service providers and containers, including AWS, GCP, Azure, Alibaba, and Kubernetes, providing a comprehensive view of what's in your cloud, along with the tools and automation you need to manage it today. DivvyCloud is proving that security and innovation are not mutually exclusive, one customer at a time. Join innovative enterprises like Spotify, Fannie Mae, and Discovery, who have found the freedom to innovate securely without loss of control. To learn more, visit divvycloud.com/cloudcast. That's DIVVYCLOUD.com/cloudcast to sign up for a free trial. DivvyCloud. Find your freedom to innovate. And we're back. And folks, as you know, if you've been listening to the show for any period of time, you know that we always love to have not only new topics to introduce you to new topics, things that we're seeing buzz in the industry about, but also we love to have new companies on the show. We've always had sort of a long history of having really interesting new startups that have gone on to do big and exciting things. And so anytime we get a chance to have a new company come on the show and not only introduce us to a technology we haven't talked about a lot, but also talk about the passion behind their company, that's always exciting for us. So excited today to have the two co-founders of Hasura, Tanmai Gopal and Rajoshi Ghosh. The two of you, welcome to the show. It's so good to have you both on.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be here. Hi, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. Hi, everyone.
So I want to get both of your backgrounds since you've both been entrepreneurial in the past. You've worked together some, and now you're starting Hasura. But Tanmai, go ahead and get started. Give me a little bit of background on you and kind of what's made you passionate about wanting to start the company.
Absolutely. So I come from a computer science background. I did my bachelor's and master's in computer science a while ago. I specialized in computer vision and machine learning. And at the time, I did some freelance consulting for a while. I worked with the defense organization in India and stuff like that. And after a little bit of doing that, I felt like I wanted to dig my teeth into something more real, which is ironic because now everything is machine learning and it seems to be machine learning. So so much for that. But I did have kind of this. I had a passion for systems, with programming languages and databases and infrastructure. And so I kind of went into. I took a kind of a hard pivot into that. And one of the things that I felt very deeply about in a non-technical sense was this idea of basically democratizing this ability to build cool things and to build new things and to accelerate kind of the rate at which we're building amazing things, whether it's individuals or companies and things like that. And so I wanted to figure out, working with people, working with like-minded people, figure out kind of what these gaps in industry are. Are they education gaps? Are they tooling gaps? And that was around the time when I met Rajoshi and we started working together. And we started a consulting firm to basically start helping companies of all sizes, from some of the largest companies in the world, some of the largest banks in the world, to even startups, to even just independent developers. And we started kind of finding different kinds of problems that people were facing that would kind of 10x their productivity. And one of the things that we noticed at the time was this data access layer piece, which seemed to be this bespoke piece that everybody was building themselves, but kind of seemed like a thing that you need not build yourselves. And so we came up with an idea, a method to automate it. And we automated that. It went into production and we got somewhere with it. So we got super excited and we were like, all right, this is good. Let's take this product out and let's start Hasura. So then we raised VC money. Five of us, we shut down the firm. We shut down a consulting firm, and five of us came out of that. And we started Hasura, and then that's kind of when the Hasura journey itself began. But yeah, that's me. Rajoshi comes from a computational biology background, but Rajoshi you should talk about that. That's interesting story.
Yeah, Shoshi, you are running COO, so which means not only running operations, but usually means running a lot of different things. But give us a little bit of your background and what's made you so passionate about working with this group and wanting to come forward with Hasura.
Absolutely. So like Tanmai mentioned, I was in the research field. I come from a computational and bioinformatics background, and I was busy doing genomics research, for the first few years of my career, and then realized that that's going to see the light of day after many, many, many years and decades, and kind of did that hard pivot into sort of, working with very early stage entrepreneurs. And the thread over there connecting those two careers is basically programming. So I went from I went from building things in the genomics world as a computational biologist to kind of teaching programming to, folks who wanted to start companies but who came from non-technical backgrounds. I was teaching them, and what happened during this, phase when I was teaching, entrepreneurs to be entrepreneurs how to program, is that I learned a bunch about entrepreneurship and startups, and this entire program basically had lots of people with successful companies who would come and speak to the students. But I also was somebody absorbing all of this knowledge, which got me very excited about working with technology, building something that could building something that me and like people I would be working with would be excited about. And so when I finished that, I sort of came back. Tanmai and I were sort of we happened to meet and at a stage where we were both exploring what we wanted to sink our teeth into, and we realized we started working together. One thing led to another. The consulting company was sort of what we first did, and from there was born like little bits of Hasura, which we then made a different company and sort of started out. So yeah, that's been my journey.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. We love to have founders who not only have been living kind of with the technology problems that they're solving, not just hey we did this at some other company and therefore we're just going to do it again, but you've sort of lived with the problems, and those problems kind of drove you to find things. So it builds that credibility of immediately understanding and empathizing with your potential clients. And then obviously, we've always seen tremendous success with companies who start with having female founders in the group. So congratulations on that. Hasura is well known for GraphQL, for really trying to do some innovative stuff in this space. But for folks that aren't familiar with the technology, maybe they've heard it somewhere, give us some understanding of kind of the basics of what the technology does, where it sort of came from, and where it's focused to try and improve how applications are built, how data is accessed.
Yeah, that's I think the best way to kind of understand GraphQL is first of all that GraphQL is very simple. It's not magical. It's very nice, but it's a very simple. It's a very simple technology, and what it does is it works at the same layer that you would have had other APIs at. So if you thought of like SOAP as a technology or REST as a technology, GraphQL is a technology kind of at the same layer. It's basically a way of defining how APIs should behave. And if you think about APIs that we used to have, like REST APIs, the idea was that you'd make an API call, you'd get some data, and as kind of over the last decade plus, as we started building more and more applications on the front end, especially mobile applications, web applications, we realized there was an ergonomics problem, and there was with using REST APIs, and this problem was that a REST API predefines the data that it will return to you. And it will predefine the data that the consumer or the application requests for. And this becomes challenging because every time you want to iterate on the application, you want to fetch a slightly new slice of data. You want to fetch slightly less data because it's on a mobile and it's not on the web, right? Or you want to fetch more data because it is on the web on a larger screen with a more rich experience. You realize that you can't do this because you have to go back to the API development team and tell them to build a new API for you. What GraphQL does is it flips the problem and it says, the way the GraphQL API works is it's kind of similar to SQL almost, where it's like saying, but at the API level. It's kind of like saying, we'll have one API endpoint, and to this API endpoint, we'll post a query. We'll send the query of what data we want. And this query is going to say that I want the user profile, I want the user's products, and I want the user's addresses. And this is the data I need to render the profile page on this application, right? As opposed to being restricted to a predefined set of APIs. Now, what this did is this gave a tremendous amount of power to application developers to iterate and build stuff faster without waiting on new endpoints that were giving new shapes of data to be built on the backend. Of course, it's introduced a fair amount of complexity, which we'll get into. But as an experience, it was amazing because it was a JSON-first experience, just like REST or the most common implementation of REST where people exchange data in JSON. GraphQL was designed with JSON at the foreground, and you kind of post a query and you get this JSON data. And the ergonomics of creating that GraphQL query, of specifying what data you want and getting that data back, is amazing. And that's kind of why developers who consume GraphQL APIs have fallen in love with it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. I mean, the two things that sort of immediately jump out at me is number one, you're probably going to see performance improvement because you're asking for a query in exactly the way you want. You're not having to kind of think about, okay, if I'm only getting predefined sets of data, that might be 2, 3, 4 queries, or I might get them in different ways and I have to do it. So that jumps out at me. But then, like you said, if I don't, if the application changes, the business environment changes, hence the application changes, I don't have to keep going back to the data team and saying, build me a new API, build me a new, test it, validate it, authenticate it. So yeah, your ability to iterate seems like it would be much faster.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's also that's pretty much been the draw for GraphQL, right? I mean, I think the whole front end and full stack developers love GraphQL for that very reason, because once there is an endpoint, they don't need to kind of depend on teams to sort of build that API for them, and the developer experience around GraphQL and the tooling for them is just so rich and so powerful. So I think that's been one of the biggest draws of GraphQL. And what's happened, but sort of where there is that tension is typically, somebody needs to build a GraphQL server, and building a GraphQL server is, it can get fairly complicated. And so what happens is, if there is the team that needs to build the GraphQL server, who's typically very familiar with, their non-GraphQL world, there is no immediate benefit that team would see in terms of building a GraphQL server. So there's usually so what we've seen is people have started wrapping REST APIs with GraphQL and sort of creating that extra layer in the middle, just so that the front end teams can have GraphQL. But, it takes a lot of convincing to get the back end team to kind of build that GraphQL server for them. So that's sort of also that's also where we've seen our adoption as Hasura, which we'll get into in a little bit, become interesting, because with Hasura, you don't actually, it kind of bypasses this whole requirement for building a GraphQL server, because what it does is you point Hasura to your database and other data sources that you may have, like other REST services or GraphQL services, and Hasura sort of gives you a GraphQL API. So the entire building a GraphQL server in the middle is just something that you completely bypass. So you point Hasura, you have a UI, you kind of create relationships between the different data models, and it just gives you that API that with the authenticated API, which now your front end teams can immediately get productive with, and the back end teams just have to make the configure these different relationships and different data sources using this sort of UI or even like basically with code.
Yeah, and that was kind of what jumped out at me was when you said, hey, sometimes you have this pushback of, nobody wants to build a GraphQL server. Was that something that, would have fallen on the database team? Is it something that would have typically fallen on the API gateway team, or, who would have, ultimately been sort of tasked with doing that before Hasura came along and is making that simpler?
Yeah, I think it would have been, it would have depended on, it would depend on the kind of use case that you have, right? Let's say, for example, it's an internal application that you're building inside like an enterprise environment, right? You're building like an internal app or a dashboard. In this case, in this case, if you're sending, often what people don't want in an enterprise environment is they don't want arbitrary teams connecting to another team's database directly, right?
Gotcha.
You don't want to say, I mean, this is what used to happen, but you don't want this to happen anymore because you can't control that access, right? You can't secure that access. It becomes more painful. You can't govern it, right? You can't say, I'm going to rate limit this team to 100 per second. I'm going to rate limit this team to 2000 per second. So you typically need to build that API. So the task kind of falls into the owner of that data, whoever the kind of owner of that data is, of that data product is. Maybe they have to staff up a team to build an API to say, let's build this GraphQL server on top of this database, right? In other kind of more external application environments like consumer applications and stuff like that, or if the app that you're building is a mobile app that an end user outside your organization is going to use, this is typically the web API team or the web server team. And this web server team was typically building REST APIs. Now they need to build GraphQL APIs, and they don't want to build GraphQL APIs like Rajoshi said because it's just work. Like as a backend developer, it's just work for me. There are zero advantages for me as a backend developer to provide this API, which is much more complex. Surface area is much larger. It's a new thing to learn. There's no tooling around it. I don't want to do that. So what often happens is that the burden falls back to the front-end developers who want this GraphQL API. So let's say you have a backend development team that's willing to give it a shot. The API development team is willing to give it a shot. They'll bite the bullet and they might give you a GraphQL API. But otherwise, what also happens, which is the third variation, is that sometimes the front-end teams themselves stand up a GraphQL service that talks to the REST API. So they tell their API development team, all right, fine, you folks don't want to bother, it's okay. Let us build this and let us deploy it. And that's fine. There are, as you can imagine, challenges with that because it's a different area of expertise, right? You're suddenly getting into the business of building and maintaining servers instead of optimizing your end user application, which kind of brings its own complexity. So these are kind of the three places where the burden falls. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, what I'm picking up on is, so you have this technical capability that if it's there is fairly straightforward to say, hey, we're going to be able to, like we said early on, you're going to be able to build applications that are more performant. You're going to be able to iterate on applications without having to make tons of changes. But yet the mechanics of getting there wasn't necessarily the drive from an individual person to have to deal with it, or the complexities of saying, well, this application needs this much performant or this rate limiting or this security, but this one's different. And so you have to stand it up. And Hasura has sort of come along and said, hey, instead of skipping that business benefit because it seems sort of painful to get there, why don't you let us bring our expertise and provide this in the middle so that you can just plug into it.
Exactly. And think of it now as a service instead of something that you have to build, right? Something that you just stand up. It's a service. It'll maintain itself. It'll run. You can upgrade it, right? So it becomes much easier to think of it as infrastructure instead of thinking of it as something that you have to build. Right. And so that really accelerates. The other interesting thing to mention about GraphQL here is also that it's not GraphQL, because it was invented at Facebook to solve exactly the two problems you talked about, which is that application development, performance, and the also being light on the network and being able to iterate faster. What's also really nice about GraphQL often gets a lot of attention in that application development space, but GraphQL as an API itself is also very nice because the tooling around GraphQL is that with REST you have to do something like you have to have an open API specification or a Swagger specification, right? That used to be called Swagger. You need to create these specifications to describe your API. And the process of creating this specification is independent of creating this API. So if somebody wants to explore your API or browse your API, it's not a trivial task. It's very painful, right? You have thousands of API endpoints. Somebody has to sit down and manually automate and manually document each of these APIs. With GraphQL, what happens is that any GraphQL server itself is introspectable. So to any GraphQL API, you can in fact make an API call and say, hey, GraphQL API, tell me all of the models you have. And the GraphQL API will return that metadata to you. and say, these are the various models I have, and these are the relationships between those models, and these are the types of every single field in those models. And that tooling is phenomenal because the ecosystem has built a lot of tools to help you browse that API automatically. And so nobody maintains this extra element of documentation of what the API is. And so this usually means that when people start using GraphQL, their understanding of the data that they have improves. And that is another order of magnitude benefit on your ability to iterate. You can build applications much faster if you understand what your data is really like and how it's structured.
Yep. Yeah. No, there's nothing.
Right. As opposed to in the blind, kind of looking at one API endpoint and be like, what does this do? What does that do?
Yeah. There's nothing worse than sort of great technology with bad documentation or bad content. It's hard to get started. You don't really know where you're going. The context is hard to figure out. So no, that's excellent to hear.
Yeah.
Rajoshi, I want to kind of get your perspective from a business, kind of the business side of things. What are, we talked about, just kind of better performing, build applications faster, but what are some of the kind of tangible business things that you're seeing driving this move towards GraphQL? What are some of the, kind of the common business patterns that people go, okay, this is where it's applicable. This is where we're going to see business value created or business cost savings coming out of.
So I think I think with smaller teams and with indie developers, just the productivity benefits that you see with GraphQL is what is driving the adoption. And I think the business benefit is that, if you're a small team, you're just able to do a lot more, build faster, ship faster, sort of all of those benefits with all of the tooling that's available. That becomes sort of the draw, and just the API experience. Developers are automatically drawn towards technology that helps them build faster and gets them more productive. So that's I think something that we're seeing in the sort of with hobby devs, small teams, early stage startups. What's happening in enterprise, though, is very interesting, because what's happening with enterprises is when you're looking at GraphQL and when you're thinking about sort of making the move to GraphQL, and because it sort of touches across several different teams, we're seeing it closely align with, quote unquote, the digital transformation journey in enterprises. So this is usually when the teams are starting to look at sort of either building new applications and they want to move to the cloud or move to newer technologies. GraphQL, serverless, the choice of databases, all of these decisions are kind of things that are happening together in the whole moving towards modern technologies, hiring full stack developers who are easier for enterprises to hire fast rather than looking for developers with very, very obscure skills. So as they are moving towards these sort of larger initiatives and looking across the stack, and optimizing for time to market, easier hiring, robust technologies. GraphQL sort of comes in as something that they want to adopt as part of that entire exercise. And frequently the biggest draw there is when again the sort of getting to market fast with whatever they want to build and yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, it makes sense. So in terms of what Hasura offers, I know there's an open source element to this that's available. That there's a bunch of community built around. There's an enterprise sort of on-premises version, but I want to talk a little about the cloud version, because it's very much focused on helping companies that want to work across different clouds. So not only consume it as a service, but also begin to work, with services that are running in multiple cloud environments. How much are you seeing of that interest from companies who say, look, we're very lucky in that I can get great services, whether they're from SaaS providers or from the IaaS cloud providers or whoever. Are you hearing that more and more, that being able to just pull great cloud services from wherever they want to is really, really important? Or are you still seeing them tend to be focused kind of on one path and you can help them in either way?
I think in terms of it's not just about multiple clouds. What we're seeing is data is fragmented. You're not really looking at, your data is no longer just in your database, right? And just because of that, automatically you're in different environments. So you will have, your data hosted in whatever cloud in your database, but then you also have your payment information in Stripe, and you have some ERP which is hosted somewhere else, and you have some CMS that's hosted somewhere else. So data is fragmented because of the way people are just building applications, and because there are specific services solving specific problems really, really well. And that is somewhere that Hasura really shines, because what Hasura does is it doesn't matter whether it's multi-cloud, whether it's different services, whether it's different teams in your organization, wherever your data is, have Hasura, you point it to these data sources, you configure relationships between these different data sources, and then you get that secure API that you can start, that your developers can start using to query data across these different data sources. So if you're in the same data, if all your services are in a single cloud environment, sure, you can definitely use Hasura, and it still has the same benefit, because even if it's in the same cloud, it's probably in different, it could be a different team and it could be a different domain. So you're still able to do that. But I think the fact that you're able to bring in and stitch data across different sources, including third-party APIs, is what makes Hasura really powerful, and something that people really like using it for.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it avoids really two things for users. One is having to deal with data gravity, right? Moving things around just for the sake of bringing it into some common location, right? The location becomes less of an issue, or the gravity of data. And then the other thing is it doesn't burden application developers with the problem of saying, well, look, something was built a while ago, and we're using that, or we're still using it to get business value out of it. I need to just change it for the sake of changing it to make it fit some other model, right? It feels like it gives them the flexibility of both those things. They don't have to be so burdened with having to make lots of changes up front just to kind of make it fit a specific model. You can consume data from lots of different places.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and I think especially for enterprise, that's a really important requirement, right? Because it's not this data migration piece is not trivial. It's very hard, right? It's you can't really take a living, breathing kind of operational data store and move that somewhere else, right?
Right.
And especially if you need that access, near real time. You can't afford taking that data, putting it in a data lake or a warehouse, waiting for a few hours, right? All of that to happen. To get access, you need instant access to that, because these are all operational end user transactional applications, right? They need that access immediately, and so the power of being able to do that in a secure way, in a performant way, that's huge. That unlocks a massive amount of business opportunity for our customers.
Right, yeah, and I think the people that realize that most enterprises, if you were to take a really pristine architectural diagram, the way to get from that to an enterprise is the first thing you do is you crumple up that piece of paper, and then the second thing you do is you unfold it, and then you scribble all over it like a 3-year-old, and then that's what their architectures look like in real life. And so if you kind of can't live with that, then you're going to struggle in the enterprise. So,
yeah, that's true. And it's not because enterprises are evil, right? It's not evolution. It's not because people inside enterprises are evil. It's just because that's real life for you. It's like things just change so fast, things happen so quickly, that you can't afford to be super pedantic about things, and this is how things have to be and how they should be. Just don't have the time.
Right, exactly. They go through mergers, they go through technology transitions, regulations come along. There's all sorts of things. What are some of the easiest ways for people that that you've seen for people to get started with GraphQL, to add it to their applications? What are some of the kind of first things you're always telling people to do to be successful?
So this is something that we've actually spent a lot of time on, because we have this entire series of tutorials that we built, which are completely vendor agnostic, to just get you started with GraphQL. I think we have over 17 courses. So so all of the front end courses that are there are essentially some, based on the stack that you come from. So if you're a React developer or an Angular developer or an iOS developer, you basically there's one application that is pre-built, and you're kind of making these API integrations with GraphQL as you go along. So you're kind of like, you learn GraphQL by making these integrations in an environment that you're familiar with. So that's something that we invested a lot of resources into, because learning GraphQL was something that people are looking to do. But this apart, I think learning by doing is definitely something that helps people sort of really understand how GraphQL works. And there are also lots of really good resources out there. Egghead has a bunch of courses. Eve, from Eve, she's done a bunch of really good GraphQL courses on Egghead. There's a bunch of tutorials. I think the GraphQL Foundation has a course on GraphQL. The Hasura.io/learn tutorials are a resource, and across the stack. I think so. There's a lot of different resources, a lot of great content on Egghead for sure. So those are good places to get started.
And I think you can find some of those at hasura.io/learn, where our courses live. But also, I think the other part of the question is, how another part of what people struggle with is like, how do you introduce GraphQL into your stack, right? Which is like, I already have this existing application. What do I do? And again, it kind of, there are two, I think, broad approaches to doing this. One is that you kind of wrap over these existing APIs that you have, right? And it's kind of a easy way to get into GraphQL. Meaning it's a low risk way of getting into GraphQL. It's still a fair amount of effort, but at least it's low risk, because the core APIs that you have, right, and the guarantees around those APIs, you're not affecting them. So that's been a popular way of kind of introducing GraphQL. The other method, especially that we see with Hasura users, is that they let their existing application run as it's running, and then they just take Hasura and they point it to the same operational kind of database, and they get a part of their API now from GraphQL. So now they start transitioning their APIs gradually over to GraphQL. And this especially works very well for the read side, because a lot of these applications are read heavy, right? And so you're able to start gradually migrating away from the REST APIs to the GraphQL APIs for reads. You continue using your REST APIs for writes, and eventually you bring the writes into GraphQL as well through mutations. And so that's another path to kind of easy migration.
Nice. Yeah, it's always good to have migrations that aren't purely lift and shift, or kind of rip and replace and so forth. So very, very cool. Well, listen, one last question, and again, thank you so much for the time today. We always love when we get a chance to learn about something very new to us. The name Hasura, where did it come from? What does it mean? What's the sort of history or the story behind it?
That's so Hasura is without the H. Asura is a word in Sanskrit, and it means demon. And the daemon is basically a pun on the word DAEMON,
okay.
which is, these background processes. Yeah. And H is for Haskell, because, the core of Hasura is in Haskell. And, when we were naming it, somebody was like demon in the name. And somebody said, hey, let's add H in Hasura. That's kind of the informal story of how it came together. But that's the name. And our logo has a lambda in it, which is scaled very well, actually, because it started off with Lambda for Haskell, but it's actually also we work really well with serverless technology, so it's kind of scaled really well. The Lambda.
Very cool. Yeah, very cool. Yeah, and the logo has the little sort of daemon, at least implications. And does the daemon have a name or a nickname or anything?
No, it's just a generic word.
I think we've interchanged. We've just used Hasura for the product and our mascot and the demon. So it's kind of been the same. At some point, maybe we'll get into the naming exercise and make a big splash about, hey, look, we've done this whole thinking about what we're going to call our character.
Yeah, more important things early on when you're starting the business, though. So very cool. Well, listen,
naming things is a hard problem.
Very, very hard problem, as we all know. Well, listen, Tanmai and Rajoshi, thank you so much for the time today. If folks want to reach out to you, learn more about Hasura, learn more about the technologies, maybe what are the best ways beyond the website to reach out and pick your brain?
I'm on Twitter at Tanmai Go. That's the best place to reach out. And feel free to reach out for anything related to GraphQL or Hasura, or just generally if you want to have a chat in general.
Okay.
And
Yeah, I'm on Rajoshi, my entire name, which is something I created a really long time back. But I'm on Twitter as well. Feel free to hit us up there. If you have anything about Hasura, we have a very active Discord community, which is at discord.gg/Hasura. So that's a great place to jump in and ask the community questions about how people are using Hasura or any questions you have about GraphQL and Hasura. And otherwise, the website is the best place to find the tutorials, stuff to get started with Hasura and anything else at all.
Yeah, that is great. We will get all those things in the show notes for anybody who's listening along and couldn't take notes. But two of you, thank you so much for the time. We're always grateful to not only meet new people in the community, but hopefully share some good learnings with the community as well. So folks, with that, we're going to wrap it up for today. We thank you as always for listening to the show. We thank you for telling a friend, for rating the show on iTunes and other places where you get your podcast. And with that, we're going to wrap up and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.